might be the case. I think we can look at militarism in two different ways. The first one is, if you like, excessive, the domination of military in decision making. So certainly there is a reasonable case to be made, particularly in the case of Germany and Austria, that the military, the army and the navy, actually have a very strong influence in overall decision making. But militarism, I think we can look at in another way as well. That is, if you like, the excessive deference among civilians for military things, for the military and a military way of doing things. One of the best examples of this, I think, if you look at the fashion in both Britain and Germany before 1914 for dressing small boys in sailor suits, which I think says an awful lot about this great naval arms race, which has been raging for some years. Now, what I would say about militarism is that it does not bring about the war in the sense that, although both Moltke the Younger, the German Chief of Staff, and his Austro-Hungarian equivalent, Konrad von Hotzendorf, have both been arguing for some time for a preemptive strike against their enemies, to no avail. It's only in the summer of 1914 when, for various reasons, the politicians suddenly come in line with the military's very bellicose ideas, that then actually war comes about. So, militarism per se did not cause the First World War. However, it almost certainly created a situation which made war more likely. Alliances, that's another very interesting point to take on board. The entire international system has at various times been placed in the dock and found wanting. So the very distinguished American historian Paul W. Schroeder has blamed what he called the spirit of new imperialism for the outbreak of the war. Basically, by this, he argues that for some time, states which had gone out and been aggressive and seized territory had ended up by being rewarded for it. So following this logic, Germany and Austria-Hungary in 1914 were simply behaving as Britain had behaved towards the Boer republics in 1899, or for that matter the United States towards Spain a year earlier. Well, again, I'm absolutely convinced that imperialist mentalities contributed to the corrosion of the concert of Europe, the idea by which you would actually bring statesmen together to argue out around a conference table dealing with major international problems. It doesn't actually help to explain why war broke out per se, particularly because contemporaries saw a very big difference between going out and seizing territory in Africa and Asia or the Pacific and actually doing the same sort of thing in the backyard of the great powers. Attitudes which today I suspect we will regard as being racist, but nonetheless underpin the way people thought at that time. And alliances. There has been for some years this sort of idea there was a sort of domino effect in 1914. You know, one state enters the war, its allies, so Russia comes into war, that brings France into the war, which brings Britain into the war, and you have this idea of dominoes toppling, bringing states into a war, which actually expands out of its immediate local origins in the Balkans. Well, again, that's not an entirely satisfactory argument, not least because if you actually look at what actually happened in 1914, it's not quite like that. Because in 1914, in effect, there are two power blocks. The Triple Entente, which consists of the French and the Russians in alliance, and the Brits in a sort of semi-detached position, loosely aligned with them, and the Triple Alliance. Now, the Triple Alliance consists of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. What happens in August 1914? The Italians decide they are not going to enter the war. Worse than that, they start negotiating with the Allies and end up declaring war on their erstwhile partners, Austria and Germany, and entering the war in 1915. So I think the domino effect is a bit too simplistic. Even more intriguingly, as the British historian Frank McDonough has pointed out, one of the reasons why war, possible reasons why war came about in 1914, was because the alliance system, rather than being too rigid, actually simply wasn't strong enough. It strikes me as being very likely that the reasons why the Germans took such a bellicose stand in the summer of 1914 was that they thought that the Franco-Russian alliance was looking a bit shaky, that they hoped that the Russians would not be supported by the French, which of course is basically a repeat of what happened in 1908, and therefore the Germans hoped to break apart this alliance by peaceful means, if they could get away with it, but by war if necessary. Arguably, if alliances had been stronger, if there had been more of the discipline which actually is involved in a coalition or alliance, then actually it might have had a greater deterrent effect, which of course is not the standard argument about alliances at all, but strikes me as being extremely plausible. And finally, nationalism. Well, nationalism, I think, is obviously extremely important, but nationalism does not necessarily translate into a desire to go and inflict war and defeat on your neighbours. Again, it's one of these factors which actually, I think, made war more likely, but did not make it inevitable. And one of the most interesting theories in recent years that has been put forward is by a British-based German historian, German national historian, Holger Afflerbach, who has put forward the idea of an improbable war. He has said that basically in 1914 there are so many things that actually unite the states of Europe, whether they be economic, the world is becoming increasingly globalised by 1914. Globalisation is nothing new. There are ties in terms of the dynasties of Europe, and the idea put forward by the British writer Norman Angell in 1910 that war was a great illusion, or he argues that the idea that one state could enrich itself at the expense of another one is a great illusion. And there is this argument that actually war took people by surprise in 1914, maybe even that because people thought that war was inherently improbable, it actually encouraged statesmen to take greater risks with the peace. So put all these things together, while the militarism, alliances, imperialism and nationalism did not cause war, it may have made war, in fact almost certainly did, make war more likely. But in order to see how these long-term trends translated into fighting, I think we need to look in a little bit of detail at what happened in the summer of 1914. The July crisis, of course, it's kicked off by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, by Gavrilo Princip, who actually is a Serb, but actually he is a citizen, or a subject I should say, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And of course, he assassinates the Archduke and his Archduchess in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina, on the 28th of June 1914. The Austrians immediately seize upon this as an excuse to go and settle accounts with the Serbs, which, as I've already said, they think they've actually muffed that opportunity on a couple of occasions in 1912, 1913. They blame Serbia when in fact there is little or no evidence that the Serbian government was directly involved. It's a little bit muddy because Apis, who was the head of the Serbian military intelligence, was also the leader of the melodramatically named Black Hand secret society, and he certainly encouraged the assassination attempt. It's been argued that in effect